So thank you, Mike, and for kind of talking about this. So after Mike's testimony, it was Terry. It was finally your turn to take the stand, and Terry, you were tasked with introducing evidence of the identification of Booth during his autopsy, up until his final burial at Greenmount Cemetery in 1869. And in his book, Frank refers to Terry, your incredibly well-organized structure as being a treat for any trial attorney. So what was it like for you to take the stand after witnessing the proceedings up to now? Were you excited? Were you nervous? Or did you approach your testimony the same way as like a lecture in your classroom?
I don't remember any particular emotion. I don't remember being nervous or, I had the confidence, and I'll anticipate your Zaid question. After he had dealt with Mike and everyone else, he had had the stuffing beaten out of him by the time he got. I'm
Mhm.
surprised he was able to stand erect and ask questions. But it was the end of the fourth day. Everyone was getting a little played out, I think, and I felt really confident about what we were doing.
So it's fair to say that you were feeling pretty okay with how things were going if I use an old photograph of you from your 1998 thing.
Brown seems to be the color back in that period of time. Everybody had a version of brown on, didn't they?
That's right. So
Yeah,
you
we did good. I remember two things I'll tell you in particular.
mhm.
When they were talking about when Zaid said something like, "Well, the Booth family deserved their exhumation," and I said they had it in 1869. I mean, how many do they get? Four, five? How many do they want? They had already had it, and I was looking at the judge at that time, and I thought that had an impression upon him. The other thing that I remember that I thought was impressive to him, the three Booth siblings who lived on the farm were dug up and relocated in John's grave. So I said, if you dig up John, you're exhuming four bodies. You want to do four? And I remember, I'm not saying a light went on for the judge, but I don't know if he had really considered it like that or not. Um,
Yeah, and that
I
is an
will, I
important
will
part to
say
make. Yeah.
in response to Bill, maybe the records at Greenmount don't show the exact location of John's grave, but no doubt he's in the plot, and there's no doubt where he is in the plot. I think that's very well established by the historical record. I mean, there was a mound there for years, so
Right.
anybody who wanted to draw by would know where he was. Now, but I'm not sure, and Bill can answer this. I'm not sure that it's customary to show in all the graves exactly. You're in the grave. I don't know if there are diagrams of where everybody is in every grave.
Yeah, some
Uh,
cemeteries have that. I don't know if Greenmount has that sort of detail. Not all cemeteries do. And as you said, yes, there's definitely pictures of the Booth plot where you have the mounds, especially after like Asia passes away or Rosalie, and you see the mounds covered in ivy that aren't there anymore, but the mounds that existed between the headstones and the footstones,
mhm.
that kind of show where people were buried. Now, Terry,
It
during
was
yeah,
interesting, as I remember it and understand it. The grave is dug. There's a brick line vault, right? And then the body set in there, the older children, whom John never knew, they died before he was born.
mhm.
And their bodies were probably only traces by 1869, were put on top of him. And then it was interesting that there were, I believe, two large granite stones that were put on top of the brickwork. And that I realized what that was about after doing some research and talking. That kind of meant be any sunk any depressions where the grave was. It provided a structure, for the dirt to settle evenly, like you see it today.
Oh, understood. I did not know that.
Yeah.
Terry, in your testimony, you essentially laid out kind of the chain of custody of Booth's body from 1865 until 1869. And if my counting is right, you submitted over 20 different exhibits showing kind of an unbroken line of positive identifications of Booth's remains before his burial in Greenmount, which is crazy, but it's a lot. One of the documents that you kind of included with in what I refer to as a heavy document on your side. It was an 1872 petition filed in the Circuit Court of New York by Mary Ann Booth, Booth's mother. Can you talk a little bit about that petition, what the purpose of it was, and why you felt it was a critical document to your case?
I don't think I can. I think that one has slipped my mind. Um, I don't know if it was regarding the money in Canada that Booth had on
It
deposit.
was about settling his estate.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one from Mary Booth, Mary Ann Booth. Essentially, it confirms that the family obviously believes he's dead, are trying to get his assets from the New York courts. I don't know if it was the Canada money exactly, but something about his estate, and that you essentially, according to Frank's book, pretty much put this out as, you know, all of these claims that the Booth family didn't know, if Booth is actually buried there. And here you have his own mother who is saying, I
Yeah.
need to, he is dead. It even said he died on April 26, 1865, this legal document from her trying to settle her son's estate. And that on the stand, you were like, if there isn't more confirmation that the family knows exactly where he's buried, it's right here.
Well, he died intestate, right? He didn't write a will.
Correct. Yes.
So there was no doubt. I don't think the Booth family needed the money, and they were a little shy probably about even doing this. But you're right. That was a very good. That was a very good document. I just happened to stumble across it when I was doing some research in New York.
And I was going to ask if you'd found that yourself, because I had actually never even heard of that until I read Frank's book. I'm like, I'm sorry, Dr. Alfred has what? I was like, that seems like a really fun document.
Yeah, I just was in the New York Public Library, and I ran across some index, and unfortunately, there was not a file of papers to go with it. Showing the follow-up proceedings and everything. But like you said, that showed the family. I mean, they're hardly going to be lying. Poor old Mrs. Booth is not going to be, doing that as part of some enormous cover-up.
Well, I mean, you have that in Bates's book where he will claim some of like Blanche DeBar Booth or claiming Wilfred Clark had stories about seeing their uncle after the fact, and yet, as I'm sure you've seen from going through the Swain papers, those affidavits, even that one from Blanche, isn't, and the Fred Black papers who investigated this, even though that affidavit isn't really so much an honest thing as it is for Blanche. She was in a dire financial strait and kind of was just like, oh, this nice man, Mr. Bates, came and talked to me, and he seems to know all this stuff. And they're far less definitive. And yet people like Nate Orlowick and will bring this up to be like, look, the Booth family claimed he was still alive after his death. How do you respond to kind of those claims?
Well, they approach these people when Bates approached them when they're kind of past their prime,
Absolutely.
or they have limited real personal contact with John the last few years of his life, the last year of his life. I mean, Blanche lived in a different part of the country, right? She didn't know, and she was kind of an eccentric character, to say the least. Once you look into her, I did a pretty deep dive into her life, and she also shared the Booth eccentricities, uh, full tilt. But I will say, I'm glad you brought up Black. I think Fred Black is really an interesting guy. I spent quite a bit of time with his papers at Oakland University, including his notebooks, where he went to Enid and interviewed this person and interviewed that person, and it was really kind of interesting. And I remember that Mrs. Bates died 23, something like that,
Something like that. Hmm.
as Black was really getting rolling on this research. And Mrs. Bates wrote a letter saying, to Black, I want you to know you killed him.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, the work you did and the tearing into his reputation and book, I think that killed him. And I thought, whoa, that was an interesting thing to say.
Wow. And yes, I mean, for everyone watching this and for everyone's knowledge, that stuff has been digitized. I don't know if it's the entirety of the Black Papers, but the University of Rochester has a very nice, I was peeking into them a couple weeks ago too, kind of in preparation for this. I was like, oh my goodness, it's just, and has this entire manuscript who, Fred Black, we owe a lot to him for, when Bates is trying to sell this mummy to Henry Ford, that he is investigating and just destroying this stuff in the 20s when, like you said, well, Bates is still alive, is thoroughly pointing out, like Mike had pointed out in the affidavit with the writing on it, Black includes that, and he noticed as well that this affidavit has has writing that was added after it was notarized and things like that. And so,
He,
you know,
he also
it's
tried to sell it to the DuPonts.
of course, you know, you got to
Right.
make money. Anyone who had money, you want to buy it. And you know, he ended up, you know, giving it to a carnival barker instead is the best he could do. Um, sorry, we got off a tangent. Terry, during Zaid's cross-examination of you, as you kind of already briefly mentioned, he attempted to get you to agree that there was a legitimate historical controversy regarding
Mhm.
the death of John Wilkes Booth, and you shut him down consistently, noting that there was no controversy among academic historians who studied the subject, or even just the greater historical community of non-academics who spent so much time investigating this matter. But Zaid implied that the press attention to the trial and programs like Unsolved Mysteries proved that a controversy existed. But again, you kept pushing back, merely stating that there'd been a lot of misinformation about the subject. So, why do you think there has been so much misinformation around the subject of Booth's death? And why do you think that this conspiracy theory in particular has gained the greatest foothold in the minds of like the general public?
It might be to some extent, and I saw this. I think I mentioned a little bit about this in Fortune's Fool. With the passage of time, it's amazing how much gets lost, even among the people of Baltimore who knew Booth, Booth family. You know, just you tend to kind of forget what happened, or you hear a story, and there's among a certain part of the population, there's a natural susceptibility to this type of story. Like they want to be entertained and to think something, and a little bit of distrust of authority, and particularly the rushed way that they did the autopsy in Washington, right? The identification of the body. That looking back, that was done way too fast, right? I mean, he was in town. He was practically buried before people even knew he had been caught. A lot of people. So I know Stanton wanted to put a cap on it and not make Booth the subject of even more attention. But it may be looking back, right? I think it was done way too quickly. And then you have that part of the population. I remember somebody, when Adlai Stevenson was running for president in the 50s, somebody said, well, Senator, uh, good news, all the thinking people, intelligent people in the U.S. support you. And he said, that's not enough. I need a majority. So you've always got these people out there who are going to be doubters, skepticals. I mean, remember even the Lee Harvey Oswald thing, right? Got to dig him up, make sure he's there. Jesse James, is he in that grave? And here we go.
No, he's back in Granbury, just like John St. Helen. I've seen the Jesse James grave in Granbury, Texas. He lived to be like 105 or something, and they claimed he's buried there. So, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Alford. We'll come back to you in a little bit. So, according to Frank, as he mentioned before, he could have closed the case after Terry took the stand.
Yeah.
The amount of documented evidence that Mike and Terry and Steve presented, as you said, Frank, was overwhelming. But you still wanted to give the final word to James O. Hall, and so I have a picture of Mr. Hall here. We briefly saw him behind a microphone in one of my earlier pictures. So here's a picture of Mr. Hall. Steve sent me this picture. This is Mr. Hall sitting on the porch of Tudor Hall, the Booth family home. And so Mr. Hall and Lori Verge, as you said, Frank, had at the Surratt House had helped put together this dream team. And Mr. Hall had been fighting against these Booth escape justice misinformation for years. And did Mr. Hall really just kind of put a cap on it? Was his testimony, he had that folksy talking as we heard before, and he had a good relationship with the judge, as you say in your book, Frank. But what was Mr. Hall's testimony like?
Yeah, well, it was folksy.
Hmm.
Uh, and he related to the judge right away. One of the things he said was, uh, and so this is kind of the way James O. Hall spoke, kind of uniquely. If there was a fabricator's corner in hell, everybody would be laughing there to see all of us in this courtroom talking about whether John Wilkes Booth escaped. And then he went on, he's one, in addition to Mike addressing, fraudulent issues apparent in the book and in the affidavit, James L. Hall testified that the book was a fraud and gave a number of examples. I won't go into them. By the way, the court opinion talks about three witnesses labeling the book to be a fraud. And I thought, well, maybe that's only two. But I think the appellate judge who wrote the opinion took Hanchett's testimony that the book was fiction to be the book is not true, not based on fact. So, but in any event, James L. Hall was very good on that. Folksy, he gave examples of gross misstatements in the book that if you really were giving John Wilkes Booth voice, no one would possibly have said that.
And so,
that going into the details. Let me just say
yeah,
one other thing about Terry, who preceded James O. Hall.
yeah.
At the end of Terry's very thorough presentation, and I was like a quarterback throwing easy passes to a good tight end, and he ran with the ball. And when he put the ball down, I threw him another one. It was a lawyer's dream how things were prepared and went. But at the end, Terry Alford had a close relationship with the judge in the sense that the judge was looking at Terry and Terry was looking at the judge, and they were actually talking to each other. The rest of us, including me, were not involved. And at one point, the judge said, Mr. Alford, if this is the civil law standard, which is preponderance of the evidence, and just for the lawyers in town, there's another intermediate standard of clear and convincing evidence. But the toughest standard is the standard of criminal conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. So the judge said, Mr. Alford, would you say that it's beyond a reasonable doubt that John Wilkes Booth is buried in Greenmount Cemetery? And Terry Alford said, absolutely, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's how strong the case was in the mind of the judge when you had the end of Terry's testimony. So, and there was James Hall. So anyway,
how about your closing arguments then, Frank? Because that's what we right after Mr. Hall is done.
Yeah,
what
well,
are your
the
closing
judge,
arguments like?
Yes, we went right to closing arguments, and Mark went first, and he was arguing, this is an opportunity to settle it for all time. Let's go ahead with the exhumation. And I was basically arguing the law and the facts that you have to respect the right to rest in peace, and you only disturb that right to rest in peace when you have a substantial reason that justifies doing that, and no substantial reason had been shown. So that was basically the arguments, and then the judge shut down the trial. It was over.
All right. Bill, I want to ask you, because you were the representative of Greenmount who had hired Frank to be your representation. How did you feel when the proceedings ended and you adjourned to await Judge Kaplan's ruling? Did you feel good? Did you think Frank had done a good job? Did you feel good about the case? Well, I think you're gonna need to unmute yourself there, Bill. You can find that little microphone button if you're still there. If you're still, we can't see you, so hopefully you're still with us there, Bill.
Okay.
There you are.
You asked three questions, and I said absolutely in all three.
Okay, so you were feeling good that Frank did a good job in your case?
Frank did a superb job. The witnesses, the cemetery really appreciates the contribution and the sacrifice made by all of the witnesses. I mean, this was in pursuit of the truth, and they were all superb.
Well, and in addition, everyone had to, especially people like Steve and whatnot, all had to pay their own way. It's not like, Frank, you weren't handing out money to help with this or stuff like that, everyone, and as Terry has said, had to drive back to Baltimore all over and over again.
Right.
So this was definitely, yeah, they made a lot of sacrifices to take part.
It was superb. And one of the things Go ahead.
It's probably the first big case I ever had when I didn't have to pay experts.
Oh, they all volunteered.
Well, they certainly apparently did, and we really appreciate it. And we appreciate it today. And thank you all.
All right, so on Friday, May 26, 1995, this is the day after the closing of the proceedings, Judge Kaplan issued his ruling.
Mhm.
Frank, I'm going to go over to Frank now. Thank you, Bill. Frank, can you describe uh, Judge Kaplan's decision?
Yeah, Judge Kaplan's decision was very standard in the sense that he reviewed the law, which I mentioned, the obligation of the cemetery, and can someone overcome that obligation with a substantial justification. And then he relied on the families, something that Terry mentioned. He quoted from Asia's book. He quoted from Edwin's book. He relied on those and said that the Booth family treated John Wilkes Booth as deceased. Mark Zay during the trial had suggested that maybe there was a cover-up by the Booth family. And Judge Kaplan reacted sharply to that and said, I've heard no evidence that the Booth family acted in any way other than honorably in the face of this assassination. So, and then he took pains to distinguish the Oswald case from this case. Oswald was out of the grave a few hours, and here we had testimony that John Wilkes Booth would be taken to Washington and there at least 6 months. So in the end, he actually ended, and I think Terry confirmed that he ended with a quote from Asia's book and said that he would deny the request for an order at Greenmount allow an exhumation.
Exactly. So the petition was denied. And here are just a collection of headlines about that. And it was very, all the news surrounding this. I decided to just do a little search yesterday to be like, let me get some headlines. And just, it was in newspapers across the country, both when the trial started and where it ended. Some of them pretty witty. I like one of the headlines here says, Booth's condition to remain grave, which I thought is a pretty witty way of saying what was going to happen, or let sleeping Booth lie, also another good one. But I'd love to know, all of our participants here, where each of you were when you learned of the ruling and what your reaction was. So, Bill, I want to start with you. I don't know if Frank was calling everybody, or Bill, how did you hear about the ruling? And you ought to unmute yourself again. Sorry about that. And then I'm going to say the same
Okay,
question to
how did
everyone
I?
else.
Well, I was delighted. And because it was race, well, at that point it was race judicata, which was subsequently affirmed in a rather witty and extensive opinion by the appellate judge, who obviously took great interest in the case. But I was aware of the fact that there would still are always going to be people who refuse to believe it and would continue. And lo and behold, I think the daughter of one of the two ladies who alleged relationship to Booth, something like about less than 10 years ago, was, and she lived in Philadelphia, as did her mother, said, "Oh, well, they were going to look into this whole matter all over again," as if she wasn't aware of the fact that her mother had already done it and the final decision had been made. But we were the cemetery was most, satisfied and appreciative, and that this was now legally finally decided.
Yes,
And
exactly. So thank you, Bill. Mike, where were you when you learned about the ruling? Did Frank call you? How did you learn about that you had won?
I honestly don't know where I was at the time, but I remember not being at all surprised. Um, I sat through everything, from beginning to end. I heard it all and I thought, well, there's only one way to decide this. And sure enough, that's exactly the way Judge Kaplan decided it. And I thought, there, now let's see what happens after this, because um, uh, is this going to be folded into the conspiracy theories? You know, the judge has been in on it all along. You
Edwin
know,
Stanton's got his hooks on the judge too,
there you go.
from beyond the grave. Terry, how about you? How and when did you hear about the ruling?
I think Mr. Hall called me, and we were both pleased. But I would ask Frank. Frank, what is the process when a ruling comes down? I mean, does the judge's office call you, or how did you find out? I don't mean to jump ahead, Dave,
No,
but I'm
that's a
curious.
great question.
What is the
Yeah.
process for getting the news?
Well, of course, today you watch the electronic document, and all of a sudden the order pops up or a decision pops up. So that's how you find out today. Back then, the way we actually found out, normally the judge would mail it out, and eventually he did mail it out. We got copies in the mail. But I had a law clerk named Paul Chin. He's now practicing law in Canada, and he knew the law clerks for the judge. He knew at least one of them. So Paul got a call from one of the law clerks saying the judge has issued Judge Kaplan has issued his decision. And Paul said, well, can I come over and get it? And Paul walked over and picked it up from Chambers and brought it back. So that's how we found out.
Was it in a sealed envelope or what?
No, I mean, I don't think so. Because the decision is public. And, once the judge issued a decision, it's public record. So that's how we found out. And we were surprised that Mark decided to appeal.
Oh, let me get to the appeal in a second. We'll do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just in other words, the decision by Judge Kaplan was that strong.
Mm-hmm. So Terry, you heard from Mr. Hall calling you and telling you
That's right.
the outcome. Makes sense, and that I'm sure he knew right away. Who knows how he knew, but he definitely knew. Steve, how about you being back in Chicago? So, we got a time zone away. How did you hear about the ruling, or did you hear? Well, can't hear, Steve. Gotta unmute yourself. There you are.
There we go. All right. I don't recall. Probably got a call from either James O. Hall or Lori Verge, one of the two. But I don't have any particular recollection of that.
You don't remember though they're jumping in the air and freeze framing like the end of an 80s movie? Like we did it?
No, I don't think so.
Oh,
The
okay.
music swelling in the
Right.
background and
Exactly.
things like that, and the credits rolling. I don't remember that. So.
Okay, wonderful. All right, thank you, Steve. And then as Frank has already mentioned and his documents in his book, Zaid appealed the ruling. And so the one courtroom sketch that we have, this is from Mike Kaufman sent to us, which is great. This is during the appeal. And so we have the 3 panel of judges as opposed to just Judge Kaplan. Frank, can you describe kind of what the appeal was like and what happened during the appeal? Oh, you're still muted, Frank. You got to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, the appeal took about a year to go through the whole process. The oral argument was in a courtroom in Annapolis. The Court of Appeals building has a number of places for lawyer arguments, relatively small courtrooms. This was small. There was probably 2 rows of seating for the public. It was full probably, and I remember there were a few people standing. And this really doesn't look like Mark, and it really doesn't look like me. But the 3 judges, the guy in the middle is Judge Wilner, who wrote the opinion. The guy on your right, closest to Mark, is Judge Getty. And then the guy on the left was a judge, his name is slipping me right now, Judge Eiler, who was a Baltimore City resident and had been a practicing trial lawyer. So the decision that Judge Wilner wrote is a tour de force. It's very strong on the law, pointing out cases where other courts have allowed the cemetery to produce evidence and also summarizing the history of the Lincoln assassination and Booth's escape to Garrett Farm and his death there with historians' accuracy. It's very well done. So on the history and the law, Judge Wilner, I think, did a wonderful job. So I was very pleased with the decision. There was one part I didn't like. So I mean, I don't think I don't have this in the book. So when its opinion comes down from the Court of Appeals, Court of Special Appeals, you have 30 days in which you can ask the judge to make a change or there's an error or something. Well, Judge Wilner had started out with a little comment about Groucho Marx, making a joke, who's in Grant's tomb? Who's buried in Grant's tomb? And I was so into this case, I kind of didn't like that that making light of what was about to come. But at the same time, Zaid had 30 days in which to appeal or file a petition for review by the highest court. So I talked to Bill Trimble about this, and we didn't want to do anything to trigger Mark Zaid. Just keep quiet and let's let the 30 days go by and then we know it's over. So I deliberately did not complain. I wouldn't have complained, but I did not ask Judge Wilner to take out the first sentence about Groucho Marx. I did ask like 3 or 4 days later, and he wrote back to me. We were doing letters then. Mr. Gorman, I got your letter. I appreciate what you're saying. Don't necessarily agree with it, but I appreciate what you're saying. But you're too late. We can only change these opinions within 30 days. So too bad.
Yeah.
Best regards or something. And that was it. So that was the only thing I didn't care for about the decision.
Hey, if that's the only thing to complain about, that's pretty good then.
That's true.
So it's 1996 and the legal case is over. Through the hard work of the 5 of you and others now past, history was defended from the fraud that was Finest Bates and this fringe Booth escape justice conspiracy theory. And yet, Steve, you have often referred to these escape theories as rubber spiders. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Well, I stole the phrase from a good friend of mine.
Oh, you muted yourself on accident there, Steve. You muted yourself again. Yep.
Oh, there we go. I have to click it once instead of twice. Sorry.
Yeah, you'll learn it.
I stole a phrase from a good friend of mine. Benedict Mariniak was a historian who lived in Buffalo and Buffalo, New York. He was head of the Buffalo Civil War Roundtable and some of the other things. I sent him the articles about that because he was very interested. And then in the next issue of the monthly newsletter that they put out through that, he wrote an article about it. Now, this is after Unsolved Mysteries has aired. And of course, Robert Stack was the host of Unsolved Mysteries. And Ben wrote an article called "How Much Crap Could Robert Stack Stack If Robert Stack Could Stack Crap?"
There it
and
is.
then through and just sent it to me without comment. And one of the things in there that particularly tickled me, he was very complimentary to me, of course, but that's okay. He said in here about the hoax, as he put it, of the idea that Booth got away. He said, trying to squelch the repetition of such tired old hoaxes is like stomping on a rubber spider. It was never real, but it simply can't be killed.
And do you still feel that is the case? Now, it's been 30 years and the trial should have killed it. Is it killed?
No.
Yeah.
No, as I said earlier, it'll outlive all of us. It'll come back again. One of the things that Zaid tried to argue in when he was giving the cross to me was about how he thought it was unreliable that we could. He was hinting that it was unreliable that we could count on the official records, the reports of what happened at Garrett's farm and the statements by the people there, because they all went to the War Department. And and I pointed out that the Emory parody letter that I cited had never been in the government archives, that I had gotten it straight from the family, and that sort of shut him up a little bit. But no, this will never end. Um, I'm sure that it will go on when our grandchildren are in their dotage and things like that.
Thanks, Steve. I want, before we end, I know we've been going long, but still, I want to briefly touch on those who continue to resurrect these rubber spider escape theories. Frank, I'm going to go back to you. I think your book does a great job of addressing the other side of this issue in a very respectful way. You introduce kind of the historians who were behind this. Of course, one of which is Dr. Arthur Ben Chitty, who is no longer with us. And here's a picture of Dr. Chitty, courtesy of Mr. Kaufman. You introduce them as the true believers of the escape story. And so Dr. Chitty, who is since deceased, was present as the first day of the trial, and you fully expected him to testify during the proceedings, but he left after the first day, and he never came back. Frank, do you know, or does any member of the panel know, maybe why Dr. or have a guess as to why Dr. Chitty did not participate more in the proceedings, especially since he was one of the original petitioners on this case?
Well, I do have some ideas or some thoughts, and I can tell you what he's told the judge.
Mm.
First off, Chitty and Orlowick did not mesh entirely. There was Chitty's modification involving Tennessee detour that he claimed Booth took. And also on Unsolved Mysteries, Dr. Chitty was not entirely pleased because a lot of his filming hit the cutting room floor, was never seen. So there was some difficulties between the two. It wasn't a perfectly calm and agreeable relationship. Chitty was there the first day. He was there the second day, but he wasn't there after that. And Mark Zeta one time says in the transcript, about the mummy, I was going to call my next witness, but he's left. And I asked Mark why, and he wasn't sure. But Judge Arthur Ben Chitty wrote a letter to Judge Kaplan saying that he enjoyed the trial. He unfortunately had to leave, but he didn't mind leaving because it was so apparent that they were going to win, and that he would order the exhumation. And you're a great judge. And Judge Kaplan, gentleman that he is, he wrote back and said, "Thank you very much for your letter." So I think Arthur Ben Chitty went to the grave believing. He has 2 YouTube episodes where he sets forth his theory. So I think he was a true believer, and I don't think the trial changed his mind at all.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do recall looking through we mentioned James Earl Hall believe after the Unsolved Mysteries, there's a picture of a Post-it note that I have in my collection where it says, this is where Dr. Chitty finds a button and sews a sweater around it. That is how he felt about Mr. Chitty and Dr. Chitty and stuff. So let's turn now then to the other half then of this, which is Nate Orlowick. And I was very, very surprised when I read your book, Frank, to see that in his testimony, Nate expressed his desire to move past the Booth story. He made it clear that he desired to see the body exhumed, but that this was his final effort regarding it, and that after the proceedings, he would move on. This is very surprising, of course, because Nate has continued to be the face of the Booth escape justice theories even to this day. Here's a picture of him from '95 and then one from 2020 when he was on one of many documentaries he's been in, again, kind of rehashing this same story over the past 30 years. All of you pretty much called Bates's book a fraud in your testimonies, and you all spent considerable amount of time noting the book's complete unreliability. And even Nate, in his testimony, tries to distance himself from Bates's book and its inaccuracies. But as Mike, as you note, he testifies that he was willing to throw the book away, but he still kept everything in it. So he wasn't being completely honest about that. And now, Frank, kindly states in his introduction that he did not believe that Nate and Dr. Chitty were aware of the fraud that is Bates's book until the trial. Steve, I'm going to go to you first, then I'll hit Mike and Terry. But Steve, as someone who has produced many articles in the aftermath of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, do you agree that Nate and Dr. Chitty were unaware of the degree of fraud in the book, or do you think Frank is being too generous?
I don't know. I don't know what their motivation is. I know that the comments that have been made during the trial was, well, we could pretty much throw that away. And then after that, Mr. Erlowick was out, and I think he was still holding a copy of Bates' book and different things. So I don't know. There are a number of people still who are writing books in support of this and the true story of the conspiracy and President Johnson's involvement and things like that. So I don't think that that's ever going to go away. So I don't know. It it would make a great story if you could really find proof, definitive proof that there was a conspiracy at the highest levels and that Abraham Lincoln, the great Abraham Lincoln, was killed by this conspiracy. That would make a terrific book, but the evidence just isn't there. And um, I like I said, I don't know, how to put um, their motivation, to speak to their motivation. Mr. Erlowick, I first noticed him in the July 1976 issue of Rolling Stone magazine. The cover article in there was about that. Nate was a teenager at the time, and there was a big spread and all of that about the whole thing. And so I don't know.
But I think that, Steve, you do a good job. Is sometimes the accusation comes from the other side that we Lincoln historians are that we make our money off of this, that this is our, we sell our books and we give our speeches and that's why we're
right,
so against them without really understanding that if it was true, I mean, we would be in support of all this stuff because we as historians want to figure out the truth as we can. And it's not
sure.
that we are, we make our money from this and that's why I'm on the outside. It's because if you had reliable facts and things like that, you would have us on your side because that's all we want. We don't have an agenda as to what to believe or
Right.
what not to. It's just this is how things
Well,
are.
I've collected a lot of stories by people who actually were at Garrett's farm over the years, and to see how it's all changed. At one point, Emory Parody, for instance, says that the shot that killed Booth was fired by a pistol. He says that in that early letter. And then years later, when he was interviewed in Portland, he clearly says that it was a rifle. And again, I'm going to quote Mike Kaufman, that you really need to go back and take a look at the earliest sources that you possibly can, because memory changes and everybody's rank gets higher as they go on. And they were closer to Abraham Lincoln, and oh, they were there at Ford's Theater, and oh, they were there for and all of that. And you have to. Um, I gave a talk in Buffalo, and in '76, I think it was, and there was a woman there who was firmly convinced that her grandfather was one of the boys that was at Garrett's farm. They went on and made a big to do about it, and there's a big fancy monument and everything in the cemetery where he's buried. And he was no more there than I was,
Hmm.
but I figured that if I exposed her or something like that, that would make me a really terrible person. So I gave a nod to her, talked about the Lincoln Avengers and things like that, because it's not my place to say, "The hell are you talking about, lady?"
Right. Thank you, Steve. Terry, I know you have to leave soon, so I'm going to give you kind of one last question so that you can duck out. I know we went much longer than we thought, so thank you for being patient. Um, Terry, in recent years, we have seen a huge rise in the spread of misinformation, historical and otherwise. And in your testimony, you questioned whether historians had done enough to counteract the claims of Booth's alleged escape. As the academic historian of the bunch, I'd love to get your thoughts on a historian's responsibility in counteracting misinformation in the historical setting.
Well, I think it's critical. Um, Unfortunately, I'm not sure what the state of. I've thought about this. I've discussed it with people, and I'm sure what the state of Lincoln studies is right now, and more basically, what the state of Lincoln is. You know how he's regarded, whether he's taught. You know, the Civil War is those of us in this group old enough to know, it's not really taught at universities anymore, right? And a lot of the military writing is done by people, the Park Service people, not by scholars. Right? There's an amazing lag. We have a scholarship we give out for the best dissertation on Lincoln, doctorate dissertation every year, and we have trouble really finding candidates, particularly worthy candidates. Once you just find candidates, right, then they have to have written something worth getting. So I'm just a little concerned, about the vigor of the movement. Now, yeah, it's a little deceptive because Ford's Theater's there and there are Lincoln sites there, and but those are institutional. I don't know if that's coming from the people. Um, it's coming from these are established institutions, so they'll perpetuate themselves, just like Washington's memory is probably perpetuated now by Mount Vernon and
Yeah.
historical sites. But what does he mean to the American public anymore, right? So I don't think there's enough work being done by the academy, if I could use that word, to correct these myths and to correct in general misinformation relating to the other things too.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem. And Terry, I want to give my last question to you too, so that you can leave us, and then Mike, I'll come back to you. And Terry, I'm just wondering now, 30 years later, you have produced, many works on Booth in the years that have happened. What information have you learned over the past 30 years that maybe you wish you had known and presented at the trial in 95? Or do you feel like what you presented was, obviously it works, but was there anything that you had since discovered that you're like, if I'd known that in 95, I think that would have, been even better to present if I could have?
I wish I had looked a little more closely at the bills for digging the grave.
Mm.
I don't think I looked at them, but I really didn't study them, and I didn't talk about them to cemetery people, 19th century cemetery historians who gave me some further insights, that I should have. I don't think we missed anything at the trial, but might have been a little more informative. Um, but I think the evidence has been out there almost since Black's time.
Yeah.
We can access a lot more. Thanks God for searchable newspaper databases and stuff like that. You don't have to spend hours of poring over a microfilm machine like you did when I was your age. But nevertheless, I think we had 95% of it pretty well in hand, right?
Wonderful. Well, Terry, I know you have to head out, so I'm going to say goodbye to you. I know we kept you very long. If the rest of you will stay on, I got a couple more questions for everybody, and then I promise we're done. But Terry, thank you, Dr. Alford, for being part of this and for defending history. Back 30 years ago, we're grateful. And everyone buy Fortune's Fool if you don't already have it. All my watchers who are watching this afterward, and I may have to interview again you specifically, everybody as individuals in the future. I've enjoyed this so much. So thank you, Dr. Alford, for being with us.
And I want to thank you and thank Frank for setting this up. And thank you, Dave, for the really, really good job you did.
Thank you. All right. We'll talk to you later, Dr. Alford.
Bye, everyone.
Um, so I am going to return back to Mike. So we had to quickly jump Dr. Alford off since he's got something else to do. Mike, I'm going to go back to asking you about Nate. And then after that, I really just have a couple questions and then we're done. So Mike, how do you reconcile? It's a similar question that I asked Steve. How do you reconcile Nate's claims in 1995 that he's going to be done with the whole affair and his attempt to distance himself from the Bates book with his continued support of the Bates theory? Do you believe that that Nate is a true believer and perhaps unwilling to accept evidence to the contrary?
Well, I don't know about that. My impression at the time was that he, um, faced with all the incoming debunking about the Bates book, he had to back off from it. But that left him not really knowing where to go or what to do because once he went back into autopilot, it was all about the Bates book.
Yeah.
And I don't think he knew anything else about uh, about the story other than what was in that book. And so he was kind of flailing around for something, and that was there. And when people are asking you questions, maybe firing questions at you or whatever, you kind of go back to what you know best. And that's the situation he found himself in.
And we've mentioned before that I've had some interactions with Nate as well, and he is a very nice man. Like just like very nice. And Frank, we mentioned before we started about how, he is never, he's the face of this, but at the same time, he has never really seemed like he's trying to, he's not like Bates in my mind. He's not like fraudulent trying to make money. I think he believes this, and that this is interesting to him and it's a very important thing to him. But at the same time, he is not, there's nothing nefarious in his beliefs. And so we all have respect for Nate. He's an adversary in a way, but, he's a respectable one. And it's just, one of those there are some people when it comes to conspiracy theories who are, they will not listen to what we say is reason in a lot of things. Or, there are people who, they are so far off the deep end in certain areas that there's no talking them back. And Nate, however, never appears in that way. Nate is very knowledgeable. He's very nice. He listens, when people bring up information. And so it makes him sort of an enigma in here because he is, a perfectly reasonable person, and yet we still have these. I feel like when I see what happened in 95 and how these theories were kind of very easily proven wrong, and yet I see him on TV 30 years later still presenting them, it's kind of a mystery to me, what he actually believes and what it is, and it's just he's an interesting figure, and which is why I wanted to ask about him.
Well, let me say a few words
Yeah.
about Nate. Yeah, he is. I've had several, uh, maybe 4 or 5 interactions with him over since the trial. He's always been a gentleman. He's always been cooperative. He hasn't sought, to my knowledge, to exploit his belief, his theory financially. And I think he's a gentle, intellectual person and a good person. Mark Zaid, the same. Again, I've stayed in touch with Mark Zaid sporadically over the years. I had lunch with him about 5 months ago. And I think he also is a good person. He was a good, jealous advocate. And based on something that Steve said to me, maybe Mark has now joined our side of this debate, that he believes that Booth is in the grave. So I don't have anything derogatory to say about either one of them. I'll leave Dr. Chitty out of it because he didn't testify. He really wasn't involved in the trial. But on the fraud question, writing things in the Surratt Society, speaking at various things, those situations are not the same as sitting in a courtroom, hearing people under oath, like Michael Kaufman did, like Hanchett did, and like James O. Hall did, and actually say that you have a deliberate fraud here. You have things that are said designed to deceive other people, to do things that you want them to do, whether it's buy your book, buy the mummy, or whatever it is. That has an impact on you. And I think the impact hit Mark and Orlowick during the trial.
Mm.
They had already agreed to abandon the Bates book because it was unreliable. But I think hearing witnesses say in a courtroom what they said, I think that's the first time it hit them like a ton of bricks.
And that's got
So
to be a hard thing, especially if this has been a core belief, like on part of some of the petitioners, like this is something you've truly believed in, and then hearing that in the court of law, that has got to be a hard thing to come to terms with.
yes, I think so.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Frank, for that. So now I'm gonna go back to Mike and Steve to ask the same question I asked to Terry before he had to go. Now that, 30 years later, are there things you have learned in the interim that maybe you wish you had known and been able to present at the trial? And Mike, I'm gonna start with you.
Oh gosh, yes. There are many things, but I'm not sure it would have been needed at the trial. I think we did everything and said everything that we needed to do and say. I did find some other things later on that I thought were uh, wow, big. What I thought
You
were
want to
big
share
things.
something? Come on, give us
Oh,
something.
Come on, Mike.
I did earlier. I said, Bates was the person who fed that story to the Memphis newspaper in the first place. That was one thing. Another thing was that I spoke to the undertaker in Enid, Oklahoma, a guy named W.B. Penniman, William Penniman. I spoke to his son, and he said no. He said uh, that mummy that Finus Bates went around the country, showing off to people, that was not the same corpse of the man who died in Enid, Oklahoma.
Oh,
I
wow.
said, how do you know that? And he said, well, because Dad brought that with him up to Ohio when we moved up there in the 20s or whatever it was. And I really, well, then what happened to it? And he said, I have no idea. I said, I'm sure he buried it. I'm sure he did. I don't know where. Um, but that was not the same corpse. Well, then, taking that as a starting point, I started asking funeral directors. Said, okay, let's say this guy is sitting in a chair, glass eyes open, reading a newspaper. Um, can that be the same mummy as that guy who's laying down flat, uh, suddenly with gray hair? And they said, no, absolutely not. You cannot have somebody who has been embalmed in one position, and that
Mm.
embalming refreshed periodically, as we're told it was, and then expect to move that corpse in a different position. It doesn't work like that. And why on earth would anybody dye the hair gray when it had been dark? Uh,
Here's the pictures to help with that
yeah,
comparison.
this is. They said these are two different corpses, absolutely. And I thought, okay, well that's interesting too then, because let's add another layer of fraud onto this. That Bates was running around the country showing off a a corpse that wasn't even the corpse that he said it was, and uh, that I thought that was big. That was really big. I don't know what happened to the other one. I had a pretty good idea what happened to the one you're seeing on the right here. And the owner of that um, wasn't about to show it to anybody because, it's illegal to own human remains. And so, yeah, he would talk about it. And I said, okay, what about the theory that these are two different corpses? He said, absolutely. Absolutely. He said, that is not the guy sitting in the chair reading a newspaper with glass eyes. That's not the same guy.
Do you think that the mummy that went on tour and went in carnivals, do you think it is still above ground today?
I suspect it is, yeah.
Okay.
Um,
I know there was like Mummies Unwrapped a few years ago tried to contact the guy who owned it and everything, and they made a whole episode as if we were finally going to see the mummy after, since the 70s, and then it was nothing. They couldn't come to terms with it. So yeah,
Well, like I said, it's not legal to own it,
correct.
and this guy that I spoke to, we had a mutual friend, and the mutual friend vouched for his sincerity and professionalism and everything else, and he said, "No, no, this guy's not. He's not a flim flam guy. He's a collector of carnivals."
Mm.
And that's how he came across this, and he prefers not to let anybody know he has it, and I promised him I wouldn't identify him.
And
So
it makes
there
sense.
you go.
If I had it too, I would not want I would not want the crazies to know where it is either.
Oh man,
Yeah.
I might mention during Michael's testimony about the photographs, Judge Kaplan remarked that David E. George does not look like John Wilkes Booth.
Oh yeah, not even. Yeah, 100%. About Steve, let's go to you. What's something that maybe you have learned over the past 30 years that obviously wasn't necessary for the trial, but you maybe wish you had known and could have presented?
One of the comments that the proponents of the escape theory, for instance, Kinsey, said was that the way that you can tell that the government didn't believe, excuse me, that it was John Wilkes Booth was that they didn't pay any of the reward.
How
That's not true
strange.
because yeah, because I even have documents in here in the Millington Parody Papers that talks about the distribution of the reward. And all of the chits and everything from the Treasury Department are online now so that you can see that. But that was something that a lot of people believed. And early in the 20th century, I can't remember the exact date, Bates got in touch with the Speaker of the House, Uncle Joe Cannon, as he was called, and he wrote to him and said, I think you should write up a bill and get it passed that would give amnesty to anyone who's still alive that plotted with John Wilkes Booth to kill Abraham Lincoln. And what was behind that was he wanted to have a congressional hearing and bring in the evidence about Booth escape and the mummy and the whole thing like that, because then he could say, I'm the attorney of David E. George. He's the man that killed him. Give me the money that was offered by the War Department as a reward for capturing John Wilkes Booth. And I mean, I read this, it's like, wow, that's really bold.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
another thing that I found not long back was I was curious as to whether there had been any other efforts made, suggestions to have the corpse exhumed. And I found out that there was one other prominent person who suggested that. In, I believe it was 1950, Dr. Richard Mudd, from the grandson of Dr. Sam Mudd, had a talk that he gave at Ford's Theater, and apparently it was standing room only. It was before the Historical Society of DC or whatever it was, and he advocated that they go out and dig up the body because he wanted to find out and prove once and for all which leg was broken, because there was some controversy about that, and this would then I guess exonerate Dr. Sam or something like that.
Sure, if it's
But
the other
those are
leg that's broken, then maybe he went to the other Dr. Mudd.
the other Dr. Mudd. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. But those are the two things. But no, I was pretty happy with everything. I don't make any. I still do a lot of research and things. Um, a lot of it online, newspaper archives and various things like that. And I still keep poking around. One of the things that I discussed at the trial was there was a little exhibit. It was a quote from the other sergeant of the patrol. It was Boston Corbett was one, and the other was Andrew Windle, who ended up in Chicago. And in Windle's obituary, there was a little snippet that appeared to be an interview with him where he discussed seeing the body on the Montauk, that he had gone down and he sure looked uh, dead enough for me. Well, I could never find that article and things like that. I suspected that he had been interviewed at some point, and about 2 weeks ago, I found it.
It
So
just took you
30
30
years
years.
later, yeah, 30 years later, I finally tied up a loose end that I had had from the trial.
Very nice. Thank you, Steve. All right, I'd like to pose my final question to Frank. So, counselor, when you consider your career as an attorney and the many cases that you've been involved in, how do you rank your experience taking part in the Booth exhumation case? And what do you hope the legacy will be of the work that you and the other members of the panel did in 1995?
All right. Well, this is among the top five, and it's actually in its own category because it's a unique case. So it is the top, and it's the most unusual, the most media attention. I will say that by comparison, I have had cases where it's bet the farm, the patent infringement. If the company is infringing, then we have to stop. 300 employees will lose their job and blah, blah, blah. So I've had those kind of cases. And when you win those kind of cases, it's very rewarding. So I get those among the top. Had a couple cases like that. But this is certainly the most unique and very satisfying, and the only case where I had sustained contact with people like Mike and Terry and even Steve to some extent, Bill Trimble, of course. Most cases, the characters get together, and despite what you say on the last day of trial, the band never gets back together. And let me make one final comment, Dave, if I can.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the reasons in writing the book, besides I just thought I had to or wanted to, was I wanted to be faithful to Professor Hanchett and say that we should confront and end the bad history. And as we've all acknowledged today, that's likely not happening and it's not going to happen. But the second purpose was to give voice to this trial, to let more people know about what Michael Kaufman said, what Steve Miller said, what's in this record, and the overwhelming nature of the evidence. So I hope the book has brought that to fore and that more people know about the trial today and maybe next year than they did 4 years ago. And thank you, Dave, for doing this.
Absolutely. And that was the point when, I first heard from you and learned that you're writing this book and you sent me the manuscript. I knew that this is important. This is crucial, especially now, to confront the bad history. And the more people who read the book, the more people who watch this video and are interested in learning more, the less people are going to fall for these very, fringe conspiracy theories, in not only about this, but in other things. When you learn to, look and be investigative in what you read and to just, have that critical mindset about things, it is to the benefit in all walks of life. And so, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure acting as a moderator for this 30th anniversary retrospective. I know it went very long, but as a member of the historical community of ours, I am a great admirer of all of you. In 1995, you each took a major role in helping to defend the practice and integrity of objective historical inquiry. You showed that research into the death of Abraham Lincoln and his assassin is not confined to the realm of conspiracy theorists. You showed the world what being a historian means and what being an advocate means, and you fought against the acceptance of fringe theories with little to no evidence. It's an honor to be in the same field as so many of you, and I thank you for the decades of scholarship and work that you've given me and the world about Lincoln's death. And Frank, I'm especially grateful to you for writing this book, Confronting Bad History. Um, it brings the Booth exhumation trial back to the forefront at a time when it's needed the most. And it's also masterfully written in a way that is accessible and easy to read. I was completely engrossed in reading it as you explain legal practices in an easy to digest way and a wonderful biography about the man behind it all, this fraudster, Finus Bates. And so, Frank, this book is timely and necessary, and I thank you so much for writing it. And for everyone watching this, go and buy this book. Go buy Confronting Bad History. Um, Go, and if you don't already owe them, go buy Michael Kaufman's book, American Brutus, and buy Dr. Terry Alford's book, Fortune's Fool, and go visit and support Greenmount Cemetery for their courage to oppose these efforts of conspiracy theorists. And join me in bothering Steve Miller every once in a while for a book about Boston Corbett or the 16th New York, so I can hawk that too. And to those of you who still feel that the ruling denying the exhumation petition was wrong, and that the wishes of these distant Booth relatives should have been followed, I'll refer you back to what Dr. Alford said earlier in 1995, when he succinctly pointed out that the real Booth family had their exhumation in 1869. And that is when Booth was identified for the last time before he was laid to rest in the family plot, hopefully forever. And there are legitimate unsolved mysteries in the story of Lincoln's assassination, but the death and burial of John Wilkes Booth just is not one of those. The Booth escape justice theory may make for interesting entertainment, and we are probably going to continue to see it on various documentaries and TV shows, but it's just not reliable history. It's just a house of cards that collapses in on itself with the gentlest of touches. So, Frank, Bill, Mike, Steve, Terry is already gone. Thank you so much for joining me today. You are each such wonderful advocates of history, and I'm so grateful to have had this conversation with you all.
Yeah. Thanks to everybody.
Well,
And
thank you. It's good seeing all of you again.
absolutely.
Yes, it is.
It has been an honor. I'm going to stop this recording in a second. So thank you for joining us, everyone who's here. Those of you who watch this for however long this is, we'll see. There's Bill. We get to see you again, Bill. Thank you so much. And until next time, I'm Dave Taylor from LincolnConspirators.com, signing off.